this idea. Look at productivity over here. Productivity is the one similar to what I showed you before, which is stagnant in the past 50 years. So this is just to say that that output and formal employment correlates highly, which doesn't support this idea of labor market rigidity. So I'm getting rid of many of these explanations, as we can see. I don't believe in the China factor. I don't believe in the rigidity labor market. I don't believe in the informality sector explanation, and so on. So there are a few things in which I do believe. But before getting into that, let me show you three other pieces of characteristics of Mexico growth in Mexican economy in the past few years, which are important in order to understand what the point I'm trying to make. One is Mexico's performance relative to the U.S. Here we have, and we have different measures, depending which one you want to look at. But this is the GDP per capita or GDP per worker in Mexico relative to that, the same variable in the U.S. See what happened before, and depending on which variable do you want to use. So before 1994, there was slightly upward trend over here in some of these indications. It reached a maximum 1982, then it started to contract. Then NAFTA came into effect, and this suddenly stabilized. Which means that, for example, let's look at this one over here, which is real GDP per worker. Real GDP per worker in Mexico in 1950 was 40% in Mexico vis-a-vis the US. At some point, it reached to be almost 70%. So Mexico was 70% as productive as the US. Then the crisis came, and Mexico lost a lot of productivity. Okay, and then, but when NAFTA went into effect, Mexico was here, less than 40%, back to where it was in 1950. And then there was, after a first adjustment over here, it basically stagnated. So since NAFTA came into effect, Mexico's labor productivity is a little bit like 1/3 of productivity in the US market. But the most important striking thing to me is how stable it has become. And what that suggests, and this is part of a paper I wrote with Robert Blecker, the interpretation I gave to this result is that Mexico has actually become like part of the North American cycle, business cycle, basically. And when you see what has happened here, for example, this is the industry in Mexico and the US. Mexico is the blue one, US is the red one. Before NAFTA, the industry in Mexico and the industry in the US follow their own cycles, basically, ups and downs, separate. After NAFTA, and just after the small crisis in Mexico, in 1995, they have basically synchronized, as you can see here. And synchronizing doesn't mean that Mexico is pulling out the US economy, of course. The Mexican economy is like 8% of the total US economy. So that means that Mexican economy is being pulled by the US economy. So Mexico has become part, somehow, of the US economy business cycle. Okay? And look how closely we are now related. And the fact that we have been growing at the same rate during the same period, and we have contracted simultaneously, first in 2000 when there was the US recession, and now in 2008 with the global recession as well. So that means that we are basically moving in tandem. And that explains why we had this previous result over here. That we are basically pretty much along the same, we are moving in parallel lines, and therefore we are not converging. So the great promise of NAFTA, which was for Mexico to converge to the US, not just the convergence, would mean that this should have an upward sloping, and hopefully reach, for Mexicans at least, reaching to 1. The fact that this is not growing, which is rather stagnant, that means, and with that the gap between the US and the Mexican economy is pretty much stable. And that's why you still observe these pressures for migration, because the gap has not closed at all. If anything, it has widened, because even though the rates are similar, in absolute levels, that gap has widened. And therefore, the incentives for Mexican workers to come to the US are still present. Now, the other thing which is important is the following. Mexico's trade against the world is completely odd. when NAFTA was discussed in Mexico, there was a lot of concern in Mexico. We in Mexico had like a lot of like Rod Perot. I don't know if you remember what the discussion was in the U.S. But Rod Perot was worried about NAFTA implying that the U.S. would be losing a lot of jobs to Mexico. This was this idea of the giant sucking sound of the firms moving back to Mexico. Well, in Mexico was something similar. A lot of people was concerned because Mexico was not being competitive against the U.S. and the industry in Mexico was going to disappear and so on and so on. Because we are not competitive. That's what a lot of people argue. Well, what has happened after NAFTA is interesting because Mexico has an extraordinary surplus against the U.S. We now, this is billions of dollars, the surplus, which means that Mexico sells goods to the U.S. In excess of the goods that Mexico buys from the U.S. from around $80 billion per year. So that's the surplus Mexico has against the U.S. Okay. So we are very competitive against the U.S. We sell the U.S. a lot of goods from Mexico. Cars, a lot of electronic goods, computers, TV, plasma TVs, you name it. Many goods, manufactured goods, actually. So Mexico has had this huge surplus against the U.S., which means that we are competitive against the U.S. But look what happens on the other hand. We have a huge deficit against all the other countries in the world. All non-USA countries, it's pretty much the same. And this is the balance, which is a slight deficit against the rest of the world. And this is basically against Asia. So we have a huge surplus with the US, we have a huge deficit against Asia. And that means that we are competitive against the US market, but we are not competitive against Asian countries, or Europe for that. So actually Mexico only has trade surplus against the US and against Guatemala. So those are the only two countries which Mexico has the surplus. Which means that we don't have a domestic engine. I mean, we are basically engaged, a link to the US economy. And that's actually the only force that is actually promoting growth in Mexico. Mexico has not a domestic engine, in contrast to many other big countries, like Brazil or so, which they might have a domestic engine from their own. And the other thing is that we have been unable to diversify trade, and particularly exports. 80% of our exports go to the US market. So, to me, given what I just said, the only explanation that I really regard important are the following three days, which I think explain a lot of what has been happening in Mexico. One is that we have poorly functioning credit market, which is the first argument that Hanson mentioned, and some others have mentioned, or even Chiquian and Ramos Francia, although at the end they don't think it's quite important. But I think lack of competition in the credit market, the banking sector in particular, meaning that banks and the financial sector does not provide credit to the private sector, is very important. So this is one thing. Second, lack of competition in general, which is partially related to this. But this lack of competition is important in all these sectors I mentioned: telecommunications, energy, and so on. So we need to strengthen the commissions, like and the antitrust commission in particular, to be able to really enforce anti-competitive behavior, and the COFETEL, which is the entity regulating telecommunications in Mexico. And third, educational levels. But not the PISA thing, the ones that measure education at the basic level. I think the main problem is particularly in tertiary education. Let me show you just which start when I am. So these are the three most important things to me. Let me show you something, and that's why the title of my talk is "Why Should Mexico Be Built?" See what has happened with education. This is data from the OECD. Share of population with access to high school, meaning that at least have 1 year of high school. Okay, and these are three cohorts: 25 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 to 64. So three cohorts just to see how that has changed the access to tertiary education levels in these countries has taken place in the past over the years. So, and it's ranked by those that have the highest level over here for the older group in these three cohorts. So the USA and the one in the lowest rank, which is Indonesia over here. So the USA, for example, has access more than 80% of those between 55 and 64 had access to high school level. Whereas in Indonesia, less than 10% had. Over the time, as you can see, USA has basically remained stable, but at a very high level. In contrast, you have countries like Korea, for example, that only 1/3 of the population, or the older population, had access to high school, but now almost everyone, the youngest generation, has access to high school. So that's a dramatic change. This partially explains what has happened with Korea in terms of the dynamic of GDP growth for this country. I was looking for Spain, but I don't see Spain here. It's Spain. Spain has also moved from less than 20% to almost 60% in terms of providing access to high school for the young people in that country. Mexico instead is here. But not only at the very lowest levels here, over here, 12% of the population had access, of the older segment of the population had access to high school back then. And now, but even with the youngest generation, those between 25 and 34 years of age, only 1/4 of them have access to high school. So, and this is just getting access. It's not finishing high school. It's just getting at least 1 year of high school studies. So you think that 1 out of 4 Mexicans is studying when they are between 25 and 34. But in this cohort of age, when they should study high school, that means that 3 of them are not in school. And that partially explains also this situation in which they don't have better opportunities, better wages, and so on. So if 1 out of 4, the youngest, and it, of course it's the lowest in this, on this group, as you can see here. And so how can we expect to have a more productive economy? I mean, what I would say is, actually, in some sense, it's America that Mexico has been growing.
I just want to make sure I understand when you say access to high school, you mean that geographically there's one near them, or
No.
that actually, no matter how close it is to where they live, they go and attend for a year?
They go and it's access in that sense, in the second sense you mentioned, that they attended at least 1 year of high school.
Okay.
So there might be problems of demand and problems of supply.
Okay.
But this is just the fact that what's the percentage population of those ranges of age that have gotten at least 1 year of high school education. And as I said, it's very low. Just think that this level of education, for example, was the one that Italy had for the older generation. So we're 30 years behind Italy, and not to mention how far are we behind all these other countries. For example, the USA probably had this level of access to high school education probably at the beginning of the 20th century, more or less, just to give you an idea how far behind we are in terms of human capital formation in Mexico. So, and that's why the title of my talk is that, I mean, why Mexico is rich? Why should it be? I mean, what have we been doing in the past few years to expect something different? I don't think we have been doing the most important things, like, for example, investing in human capital. Now, think about credit to the private sector, which is the other thing, just to give you an idea. These are all the countries ranked here, and this is banking credit to the private sector. Okay, Mexico is right here of all these countries. Mexico is between just to give you an idea, it's between Botswana and Burundi, 2 African countries. And from all the other countries over here, there are only African countries and Argentina. Argentina, because it had these big problems at the beginning of the century, this financial crisis. Other countries which are the interest to Mexicans, at least, are, I'm putting here, Brazil and Chile, which are Latin American countries, or the BRICS, Russia, India, and China over here. So Mexico is well below all these countries in terms of the financial development. So what that means is that the banks in Mexico actually are not lending money to the private sector, are lending very little. Mexican financial system in Mexico is as developed as an African country, which used to be are much poorer than Mexico is. So let me skip all this. And that has to do with high concentration in the banking sector. For example, the 2 biggest banks in Mexico have 55% of total profits in the sector. When you had the 4 biggest banks in Mexico, They have 80% of total profits in Mexico. So they are huge banks, national banks in Mexico, which is not like in the US. In the US you have thousands of banks. And even the two largest banks in the US are like 10% of total profits at most. In Mexico, the four largest banks have 80% of total profits. The six largest banks have 92% of total profits, or 82% of assets, 85% of deposits, 94% of income from fees, and so on. So it's highly concentrated. So it's an oligopoly, actually. It's an oligopoly in Mexico, which actually decides, by collusion, decide to charge high interest rates to lenders, and lenders do not take that risk. And therefore, and you might ask, well, how is it that these banks are profitable? Well, they are profitable because they charge high fees to those few which are the customers, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they lend money to the government. And that's the way they survive, and they are among the most profitable institutions in Mexico, and are probably the most profitable segments of the international banks in the world, because of the high fees they charge. And now, why is that important? Why is credit to the private sector so important, and why I think that's critical to understanding the performance of Mexico? Well, there's a large literature discussing that. It's important for factor accumulation. If we have a good financial sector that lends money to people who has a good idea, that promotes factor accumulation. So think that you might have a good idea, you go to a bank here, and then you get some money, and then you start a business. Well, that doesn't happen. I mean, you cannot go to a bank and ask for money, because if you are a small business, it's very hard for you to get that loan. If that happens, therefore, that means that you cannot, it inhibits factor accumulation in general, on the one hand. So we cannot accumulate capital enough, which is one of the factors of growth in any economy. Second, diminishes factor productivity growth. And diminishes because what the banks do is they tend to lend to those firms which are very well established, which are very profitable, like large firms that export, multinational firms, for example, which is the more secure investment for a bank, if you think about it, which is fine, except for the fact that those are not necessarily the most productive firms in an economy like Mexico. The most productive firms in an economy like Mexico are probably the smaller ones, or medium-sized firms. So by lending money to the big firms, which can actually borrow from abroad, the big firms in Mexico, like Ford, or all these multinationals, can actually borrow in New York. They don't even have to borrow in Mexico, but they do borrow in Mexico. So by lending money to these big firms, we are allocating resources to sectors and firms and areas which are the less productive in the economy. And that's why I said it's not the problem of generating jobs, it's which jobs are we generating. And we are generating low productivity jobs because we are lending money to those firms which are low productivity firms. And we have, on the other hand, low productivity labor force, because it's not well educated, as I showed you before. So, and having credit to the private sector is important because promotes, there's a paper, a nice paper, that shows that financial development promotes, which is called convergence to the technology frontier. Because when a firm has access to this money, can invest in new technology, can adopt new technology, can actually adapt new technology and so forth. So they can converge to the technology frontier. And this is not what's happening in Mexico. We are not converging to the technology frontier, which in this case is, for our purposes, is basically the US market. As we saw before, we are not converging at all. And part of that, I think, I'm trying to argue here, has to do with this. It also has an impact in terms of expanding firm size, which is important. So private credit to the private sector means that micro firms can become small firms can become medium-sized firms, and medium-sized firms can become large firms. And that something is not happening. So we have a large number of micro firms, micro-sized firms, which are fine, but they tend to be also very vulnerable. They die a lot. They disappear very often. So we cannot actually expand the firm size in Mexico, average firm size in Mexico. So that's why credit to the private sector, which is something that many friends over here in some of these indications reached a maximum in 1982, then it started to contract, then NAFTA came into effect, and this suddenly stabilized. Which means that for example, let's look at this one over here, which is real GDP per worker. Real GDP per worker in Mexico in 1950 was 40%. In Mexico, vis-a-vis this idea, look at productivity over here. Productivity is the one similar to what I showed you before, which is stagnant in the past 50 years. So, this is just to say that that output of formal employed correlates highly, which doesn't support this idea of labor market rigidity. So I'm getting rid of many of these explanations, as we can see. I don't believe in the China factor. I don't believe in the rigidity labor market. I don't believe in the informality sector explanation, and so on. So there are a few things in which I do believe. But before getting into that, let me show you 3 other pieces of characteristics of Mexico growth in Mexican economy in the past few years, which are important in order to understand what the point I'm trying to make. One is Mexico's performance relative to the U.S. At some point, it reached to be almost 70%. So Mexico was 70% as productive as the U.S. Then the crisis came, and Mexico lost a lot of productivity. Okay, and then, but when that went into effect, Mexico was here, less than 40%, back to where it was in 1950. And then there was, after a first adjustment over here, it basically stagnated next to the US. Here we have, and we have different measures, depending which one you want to look at. But this is the GDP per capita or GDP per worker in Mexico relative to that, the same variable in the US. See what happened before, and depending on which variable do you want to use. So before 1994, there was slightly upward